Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again. So my name is Colleen Doherty. I'm an assistant director with the Center for Research and Fellowships. I use she, her pronouns. And welcome to our resume writing workshop for fellowships. Obviously today, one of the things that we're focusing most on is UK fellowships, but the information that we'll be sharing today will definitely be applicable to other fellowships as well. So if you're considering Fulbright or some other postgrad fellowships, even though this is going to be a good exercise and a good, good opportunity to kind of reflect on the work that you've done in the past and what to include in those applications. So to get us started, at this stage of your academic careers, most of you have at least seen a resume, right? Like you've gone to maybe a resume workshop that the Colley Center has put on. You've probably already written one. You might even have one from maybe some internships, student jobs, volunteer work, maybe club applications, things of that nature. But resume writing for fellowships is a little bit different than some of those other things that you may have written resumes for in the past, or crafted a resume for in the past. With fellowships, there are some things that obviously do overlap and other things that are going to be specific. So just kind of keeping in mind at all times, always a good tip for all kinds of writing, but especially for resume writing and any kind of professional writing, keeping in mind the purpose for which you are writing. So in this case, you're really writing to show kind of three main things with a resume for fellowships. So one, kind of showing the alignment between your professional experiences, volunteer experiences, academic experiences, all of the things that you have basically done over the course of the last 4 to 6 years. You want to make sure the things that are aligning with the reason that you're applying for this fellowship, right? Whether it's a grad program, in this case, UK fellowships, right? And the graduate programs that you're interested in applying for through those, how do those achievements, those interests, those experiences align with the focus of this particular fellowship that you're applying for? To show the experience that you have. So again, kind of highlighting the work that you've done that has prepared you to apply for this particular fellowship, and also to apply for the things that that fellowship will fund, whether that's you're applying for research funding, applying for a graduate school, showing the experiences that you've done, that you have, that are going to prepare you for that fellowship, are always going to be important. And especially showing that sort of those through lines and that commitment to specific issues, specific interests, specific experiences are going to be very, very important when kind of crafting that overall narrative that you will be crafting for your application and with your application. And finally, it tells a story, right? So your resume is in some ways this timeline of the things that you have done, the things that you have accomplished, the skill sets that you have acquired over the course of time that are going to kind of give a frame of reference for your review committees, for the reader, for your application readers, to really get a better understanding, more context for the things that you have done, for those experiences that you've had, and how they relate to the work you want to do in the future. So your resume is going to be a really important tool for you in showcasing all of those things that you have done in the past. Some things to think about when you're kind of crafting your resume, especially for fellowships, is considering sort of how you're organizing the material and those experiences on the resume. Some sort of more traditional job headings and sort of traditional organization may work for a particular fellowship, depending on what that fellowship is and the experiences that you have had. But depending on those experiences, depending on the mission and focus of the fellowship, you may want to consider some different styles or different types of organization, especially kind of around themes, around the things that you've done to sort of better highlight those your qualifications and those skill sets that you're bringing sort of to the table when it comes to the work that you're doing. And so the structure of that resume may look a little bit different from what you're typically used to. And we'll look at some example. We'll look at an example in a little bit. But right, if you're thinking about sort of the typical resume, you've got your heading, you've got your education at the top, and then you kind of just have like a giant section of professional experiences. Maybe you're applying for maybe a research position. You may have a separate section of like research or conferences that you've presented at, or publications, things of that nature. But that's typically kind of like, right, like your professional experiences that you've had, sort of the academic experiences that you've had, if those are relevant, and maybe some like activities or extracurriculars for like a job, right? That's what's typical for maybe like a job application. For a fellowship, especially for a fellowship that has very specific themes, focuses, you may want to organize your resume a little bit differently, especially for any kind of fellowship that really highlights leadership, like the Marshall or the Truman Scholarship. So that would have been for folks last year, or for juniors earlier this year. You know, you're going to highlight your leadership work. You might highlight research if that's an important, you know, again, those research experiences that you've done, and kind of combining all of the different experiences, academic, professional, volunteer, internships, extracurriculars, into those headings instead of lumping all the professional, all the volunteer, all of the research together. Kind of may mix things up a little bit. Again, to kind of fit the themes that you are trying to convey. A couple of things to keep in mind as you're kind of crafting your resume. You always want to be concise. Now, I wanted to kind of give a little caveat to some of this. It will depend a little bit on your field and your discipline. You may have gotten suggestions, advice from faculty or mentors, or other advisors on campus for, again, in regards to job applications or resumes for when you're applying maybe for research funding. That's all going to look a little bit different depending on your discipline. But for fellowships especially, you're kind of looking, again, to highlight all of those experiences as holistically as possible. And so what we typically will advise is like no more than 3 to 4 bullets per line, or I should say per experience, and no more than 2 lines per bullet. And again, we'll kind of walk through what an example of that looks like. You want to make sure that you're being concise in in your description of your experiences and your description of your responsibilities for each of those bullet points. You want to be strategic about the wording just as much as the content of the bullet point itself, and really ensuring that you're kind of hitting the same and using the same language that the that the fellowship or scholarship uses in their own materials, not just the application materials, but the rest of sort of the rhetoric that they use to describe the fellowship, the experience, and all of the things sort of that you get out of that experience, right? Especially for fellowships that are a little bit more cohort based and organized. They're going to have a lot of information on their websites about the types of work and experience that you're going to get out of it, like how they view that particular fellowship. You do want to kind of use some of that same language as much as possible, and where it makes sense. You don't want to throw all of that language at the paper and kind of then it looks a little scattershot and not as cohesive. Like you want to be as cohesive as possible while still sort of incorporating some of their own language and rhetoric. Always starting with a verb. And this is where we kind of come to point 2. Action and active verbs. So we kind of have a note here about I'm actually going to put this in the chat for folks so that you have it for reference in the future. There are lots of lists like this one. This one is from Wellesley College, and it is a very great list. I like the way that they kind of break things down by kind of like the types of work that you've done. But similarly, there's lots of similar lists out there that kind of break it down in this way, but you always want to start with an action verb. And you want to be as specific again with that verb and with that starting word as possible, because that's really where you're leading off with what you've done in that particular experience. And that is going to, even with that one word, really help to convey to your reader what exactly it is that you do. Saying helped to do something doesn't really tell your reader what it is that you particularly contributed. So if you say, I helped to organize an event on campus that got, 1,000 people, still doesn't tell me what you did. Now if you were the person who drafted the communication materials for your organization's email campaign and flyers and other promotional material, that tells me a lot more about what it is that you did in order to help organize that event that brought 1,000 people to that particular event. That tells me that you have some skills in maybe graphic design, you have some writing skills, that actually tells me a little bit more about what it is that you did. So you want to be as specific as possible, again, in the wording of the whole bullet point, but just as much with that first word that you're leading off with. And again, kind of to the third point, similar, being specific about the details that about that particular experience, and the extent of your own responsibilities and the impact that you had in in that experience. If you wrote a policy paper or a memo or multiple memos for an internship that you had, what was the memo on? What kind of impact did it have? Did that, help your organization, your team make a decision that directly impacted the communities that you're working with, maybe, or if it was a Hill internship, impacted the work that that congressperson did, or what were the things that you did that made an impact, and how did you contribute to that impact? And always leading with your impact, point 4. So what is it that you did, right? As much as it is wonderful and lovely to give your own team the accolades that they deserve, that is for your team to do together as a team, and maybe for you to talk about in an interview or to expand on in an essay. With your resume, you're focused on one person, and that's you. You are focused on your contribution to that particular experience, the impact that you have had, because your resume should be about you and your responsibilities, your experiences, and your contributions. So again, I know earlier I did, but gonna give another shout out to the Colley Center. They have tons of great templates, checklists, things to include, more resources sort of similar to the verb list that I shared. So definitely go to them as well. They are a great source of lots of material and lots of templates, lots of resources for you as you're kind of crafting a resume for fellowships, for all things, but also for fellowships. Some things to avoid. So kind of going off of a point on our previous slide, avoiding some weak verbs. So again, helped, participated, I would honestly even say managed can be kind of vague if you don't, if you aren't specific about the things that you did in the rest of that bullet point, being as specific as possible with the rest of that bullet point. I'm kind of so-and-so on the word managed, but things that you want to make sure that you're being as specific as possible in sort of your verb choice to get started. You don't want to be redundant, so trying to avoid redundancies as much as possible. Your resume isn't necessarily a place to list everything that you've ever done, or especially with fellowships where you're most likely going to be submitting a transcript. You don't need to include your coursework on fellowship's resume unless they ask for it. Caveat, nice little asterisk there, unless they ask for it specifically on your resume. If they don't ask for it, That's what your transcript is for. If you have to submit a transcript, you don't necessarily need to include all of your courses. And again, your resume isn't necessarily a place to list all of the things that you've ever done in your entire life. You want to make sure that you're tailoring it to the experiences that are going to be relevant to your application. Always make sure to follow the formatting guidelines that are provided, and any other guidelines that are provided. So again, if a particular fellowship requests that you include your coursework on there, go ahead and include that coursework. If they are requesting a resume that is, 12-point font, 1-inch margins, all of those things, like, a particular font, Times New Roman, if that's what they're requesting, make sure to do that. Whether or not that's your preference, they're requesting that formatting for a reason. And so it is always important. You don't want to, you don't want your application to be disqualified on, something as small as, font size or font style or type. When you could have had a really great resume, but you didn't follow their guidelines. So always make sure to follow their guidelines. Don't include photos. Excuse me. Don't include photos on a resume, especially for a fellowship's resume. It's one of those things that in some instances or in many instances can be a point of bias. And you want to avoid as much bias as possible, whether, you can control what other people are thinking, what experiences that they have had. And so that is like one reason to not include photos. There's lots of reasons to not include photos. That's just one of them. Another one, if they ask for a photo for fellowships, usually they're going to ask for a photo down the line in the event that you are selected as a finalist. But if they're asking for like photos upfront as some part of the process, come and talk to your advisor first and kind of chat with us about what that means and why they're asking for that. Question in the chat: is the slide saying we should or should not use a font size below 10 point? I would say don't use a font size below 10-point font. It starts to get a little difficult to read below 10 points. And while most of these folks are probably using, while you are submitting in an online portal, some folks will use the online portal to read your resume, and that will give them the opportunity to zoom in, zoom out, all those fun things. But there are still a lot of people that like to go old school and print out their materials to read and make notes on. So, if they're printing out a resume that's 10 point or that's smaller than 10 points, like 9 or 8 points, that can get a little difficult for them to read. And again, you don't want to, be inadvertently disqualified because they found your resume difficult to read. And so they're not giving it as much time as they would to someone else's. So making sure to follow guidelines. Again, I would say no smaller than 10 points. 10 points should be the absolute smallest that you're going for your font size. And your margins should be no narrower than 0.5 inches or a half an inch. And again, there's a few different reasons for that that I'll go over in just a minute when we kind of look at an example. But again, that also has to do with the ease of reading for your reviewers. If you want to make sure that you're kind of balancing the white space, the negative space on the resume to the text, because if you're just trying to read like giant blocks of text, that can also get a little unwieldy and a little bit difficult for some folks, especially if they have any kind of vision impairment. Even if they're, in that instance, they may either be using some technology to review your resume, but if they're not, or if they don't have access to that, that makes things harder for them to you want to avoid anything that's going to make it harder for your reviewers to read your resume and to read your materials. And again, most of these materials are being submitted in an online portal, but in the event that someone is going to print off your materials to read them, you want to make it as easy as possible for them to read it in the event they have a hard copy. right, also adjectives and objectives. So the objective, when we say the objective, we're usually referring to sort of like that section that is sometimes seen at the top of a resume. That's like your objective section. That's sort of like between your header and your education section. That is not needed in a fellowships resume. Sometimes, again, like sometimes that might be typical in a job application or a job resume that you've crafted and created. But on a fellowships resume, all of that's going to come out in your essay materials. That's going to come out in the rest of your materials through like kind of, again, this narrative that you're crafting through your essays, through your short answer questions, through your rec letters. The objective that you're trying to reach as part of this fellowship application is going to come out in other ways. And so you want to take that out, gives you more space to work with, gives you more space to include some of those experiences and responsibilities and things that you've done in your past. You also want to avoid adjectives. You kind of want to let your experiences speak for themselves. Leave the adjectives to your recommenders and to your endorsers. Those are the people that are going to be like really highlighting and like kind of hammering home how absolutely wonderful you were as a student and how brilliantly you deduced something in your research experience. Those things, those adjectives, kind of like that, those glowing recommendations should come from your recommenders, not from you. You should let your experiences speak for themselves. And always making sure to edit and proofread. I think on resumes especially, this kind of tends to get on the back burner a little bit. You want to make sure that everything on your resume is consistent in terms of spacing, formatting, writing style, use of punctuation. Some people are pro periods at the end of their bullet points. Other people's are anti-bullets or periods at the end of their bullet points. Either way, whichever way you prefer to go, make sure that it's, that you have that for each of them. You also want to make sure that you're getting some feedback from the folks, from folks that know you well, know your experiences well, know your content areas well, so that they can maybe help to highlight or help you to highlight some experiences that you may not have thought to include that would actually be really important for you to include, right? Having that sort of outside perspective is always going to be helpful in any kind of writing, including resume writing. And again, in terms of guidelines, making sure to make sure that you're hitting the page length or requirement that they're noting. So if they are asking for a 2-page resume, submit a 2-page resume. If they're asking for a 1-page resume, make sure it's only 1 page. And also make sure that you have filled all of the space on those 2 pages. Or on those pages. So in the event, right, that it is a 2-page resume, you don't want to submit a resume a page and a half long. It's a whole half a page that you could have used to, add more experiences that you've had that could potentially be relevant, expand on some bullet points that would have been, really important for you to include, that maybe you excluded for the sake of space, for lots of other things, right? There's lots of opportunities, lots of things that you could have included on that resume that now are sort of lost, that you've like wasted half a page by putting nothing on it. So always use your full amount of your page length when writing a resume. A couple of things, especially kind of getting back to that note about the adjectives. There is a huge difference between highlighting an experience that you've had and sort of leading with the accomplishments that you have and the things that you have done in your life, and misrepresenting what you have done to make it seem like your contributions were better or that you had higher achievements. Your resume really needs to reflect an honest and accurate and critical reflection of the experiences and credentials that you hold. Few things, obviously, just pure outright ethics is unethical to misrepresent yourself on a resume. Worst case, like best case scenario, you just look like an unethical person, and you're just going to have some really negative experiences potentially with the folks that are going to support, that would have supported you in this process. Worst case scenario, you could potentially get into legal trouble. With fellowships, not so much, but definitely with jobs. You never want to misrepresent what you were putting on your resume, because it could get you into some serious trouble. Couple of things to think about, right? As you're writing your resume, if in the event that, this is publicized and, say you get the nomination, you go through the whole process, you get the fellowship, this is being publicized now through Georgetown's, Georgetown's news, alumni news. It might get picked up, through the Rhodes Scholarship, might get picked up by national news, or, at least some news outlet somewhere. And especially within the academic circles, that's definitely going to get picked up. And then it turns out, hey, that faculty member that you said you did research with, you actually only worked in their lab for like a week and then you quit. And now you look like a liar. And now you're potentially getting your fellowship rescinded. These are some things you don't want it to happen. Be ethical, be honest, be upfront, be accurate about the representation of the things that you have done. If you're ever unsure about how best to represent yourself, especially sort of in regards to those experiences that you've had, maybe serving as a research assistant, or in those scenarios where you were supporting another person's work, you can always ask them, talk to them, go to their advising hours, or go to their office hours. Let them know, hey, I'm applying for this fellowship. I want to include this on my resume. I just want to make sure that this sounds good with you, especially if you're asking them for a letter of recommendation. You always want to talk through your resume with your recommenders, especially if there is a major experience that you're highlighting where you worked with that recommender. So, resume versus CV. A lot of folks have kind of heard those two terms interchangeably. CV stands for, excuse me. CV stands for curriculum vitae. A CV is typically longer than a resume. Resume is usually like 1 to 2 pages. A CV can be much longer typically, and is usually a sort of fuller, longer, more comprehensive sort of overview of someone's full professional lifetime, right? And professional experiences. All of that person's academic awards, their research experiences, their publications, their professional experiences, any accolades, volunteer work, that again relevant to the position, but like full like timeline of all things relevant to that particular position, which typically will go over 2 pages, usually more along the lines of like minimum 4, 5, 6, and potentially longer, especially the later you get in your career. CVs are typically used more in academic settings, so seeking research funding, applying for academic jobs on college campuses, faculty jobs, research positions, at research institutes and organizations. If there is a strict limit, which a resume typically will have by implicitly being a resume, that is going to be your best bet. If it's a 2-page minimum, you're going to be looking at a resume specifically. And again, your resume is going to have, thinking back earlier to sort of like the way that you're grouping things thematically, a CV has sort of a very specific style, especially around the grouping of experiences and the organization of those experiences, whereas a resume is a little bit more flexible in how you're organizing those experiences and the work that you've done. So speaking of an example of a resume, so this is kind of a a good example of a resume. You know, there are a couple of things here and there that we may kind of walk through and sort of notice, maybe would have done this differently, which we'll do in just a second, but just in terms of like looking at one, right? This is pretty typical when you think about the example of a resume. You'll have your header at the top with your name, your contact information. Some folks will include their pronouns if you feel that that is something that you want to and should include. If you're concerned again about bias, maybe don't include them. But if you know that the organization and place that you're applying to is welcoming, including your pronouns, things of that nature, also would be good to include in your header. Typical sort of organizations, your education at the top, this sort of space between your education and your header is like usually where that objective would go, but on a fellowships resume, you don't need to include that. So for a good fellowships resume, you'll have your header, you'll have your education. How you organize the sections and like how you sort of format your sections is up to you. What is pretty typical is, you know, having the name of your university, your academic school, if and where applicable, and the location of your university, and then the degree programs that you hold. So if you are currently just seeking a bachelor's degree, you know, you wouldn't have your master's here, but if you are also maybe an accelerated program or seeking a master's degree, you could have your master's degree here, and note that, you know, that your expected graduation date is, you know, May of X year, and like when you did receive, or if you're actively in a master's program and you've already graduated, you know, you'll always want to include that first. Everything will be in reverse chronological order. So you can kind of see here, right, this person has their master's degree first and then their bachelor's degree, because their bachelor's degree is finished, and at the time that this was used as an example, maybe they were actively in a master's program. Same thing with their professional experiences. You can kind of see here that the end date of you have your most recent experience first, and kind of going in reverse chronological order. In terms of, you know, using seasons versus months, I typically will err on the side of months for two reasons. One, it's easier for you to remember in the future, right? 4 years from now, you're not necessarily going to remember, did I do that fellowship during, you know, June and July? Was that July and August? Was that June to August? I don't really remember. And so like, it's helpful for you, you know, in 5, 6, 7 years down the line, like just even when you're not including it on your resume anymore, having it for yourself, always helpful. So I usually err on the side of including the months rather than a season. You again will have your the experience itself, like where you were working, the location of that office, your title, and some bullet points to kind of note what it was that you were doing. You know, in this particular example, this is a good example of sort of a thematic, a particular type of thematic organization. So this one is like all of this person's awards and fellowships. It's, you know, their fellowship at the Berkeley Center, a research fellowship that they had, a summer research fellowship that they had, you know, being part of the Carroll Fellows, you know, being asked to speak at an academic conference, and the work that they included in, or that they spoke about. So kind of have a nice sort of organized, like particular academically organized chunk of work here. And then they move on to their research experience. So again, you have, you know, the institute organization that they did that research with, where it was located, the time, the sort of time frame when they did that work, their title, and then some bullet points to kind of like, you know, explain what it was that they did in that work. You can kind of see a couple of typos here. You know, they didn't include a period after doctor. You know, that's something that would want to go through and make sure that you're being a little bit careful of. This is why it's important to proofread your resume just as much as you would any other type of writing. But again, you've got reverse chronological order. The organization formatting is pretty consistent. And they're including things that are, you can kind of see a through line, right, of the different experiences that they have here, as far as the type of work that they did and the mission or vision or goal that they had in doing that work. So thank you all for coming. A couple of things that I do want to note that for folks that are on, or I should say watching the recording, you can go to our website, crf.georgetown.edu, to our fellowships toolkit, and that will also provide you some really great resources on sort of all aspects of fellowships applications. For the folks that are with us today, I put that link in the chat. But that has some nice, it's, as it is described, it is a toolkit with lots of different resources on crafting an application, creating your personal statement, how best to support your recommenders, how to sort of cultivate those relationships with potential recommenders, defining your issue area. And that was one, you were with us a couple of weeks ago, and that was another workshop that we did. If you have questions about the resume process, you can email us at fellowships@georgetown.edu. And thank you for watching the recording. If you've joined us for the recording, if you're with us today on the Zoom call, thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. And we will